Hello and welcome back one and all to episode 8 of Space's Hard Vacuum with Cerberus. Today, as you can see, we're going to start off with the manned flight program. And this here is very simply, as you see at the top, it's a test. Obviously this rocket isn't going to get too far anyway. It's just the test of the launch escape system and the staging and whatnot. So we get right out there and we're just going to fire it up. And that's that. All this was for is just to see, and you can already see it's not gone quite as I'd planned, because now we're firing the retro rocket, and the staging wasn't quite right. Actually, the staging is fine. I just needed to, it's going to take some refinement to action groups to tell it what to disengage and what to jettison, so that we're left with just this as simply as possible. We don't have pieces raining down past us like that, because that would probably be bad. So that was the first test, and there were a few of these, and gradually I sort of figured out what needed to come apart at what time, and it all works out in the end. But and of course, you know, we weren't going to mess around with any unmanned tests. Jebediah is sitting in there for the ride because he said unmanned tests. Who does those? It's Jebediah Kerbin. He wants to be in that thing. So we try it again, and we hope to get everything working a little better this time. Jebediah's in there loving it. And it didn't really work a whole lot better, but at least we didn't have to at least we didn't fire the retro rocket. So that's a little bit more better. We'll watch that descend gently down. This is the important part. As long as it does this at the end, then I guess it works to some degree, because it just goes boop and lands and nobody gets blown up or killed. Just kind of the idea. So then the next stage is to just to skim space. So what we have here is I basically took I think the first launch vehicle I made, or pretty close to it. I think this was the Stiletto one. I took off the second stage and cut down the first stage, and that makes our little launch vehicle for the suborbital Venture program test. I chose Venture. It seemed sort of optimistic and exploratory, and all it had that spirit without just, you know, I didn't want to call it, didn't want to copy anything. Didn't want to just pick a different planet name than Mercury, even though it's the Mercury capsule that we're using. So yeah, this is the suborbital test rocket that I was thinking of. They had I think it was called the Little Joe. It was a very stubby kind of launch vehicle like this, and I think the American space program used it for some early sort of test flights. They might have even used it for exactly this purpose, just to throw something up into space and see what happens. And now we get to see what happens when the one-off modification to the lower stage of the Stiletto 1 lifts off away from the Earth and carries Jebediah again, of course. This is a Kerbal space program Let's Play after all. How can we not have Jebediah be the first Kerman in space? And I'm being clever there and setting up the MechJeb utilities to limit maximum acceleration to 40 meters per second, which is close enough to approximately 4G. See if I can make this a nice, smooth, easy ride for our friend Jeb. I know this engine does throttle, though we'll have to see if it can throttle down enough to keep the maximum G-forces down to around 4. 4 isn't bad. I mean, I would think for the uninitiated, 4 Gs is kind of a big deal, but it's perfectly survivable. You don't really start. I mean, it's 9, I think, is when things start being considered fairly dangerous. That's when you see, airplane, jet pilots blacking out, and if you sustain that kind of force for a long time, it can be bad for your health, which is modeled in the Deadly Reentry mod that I have. It's not just the heat and whatnot that's modeled in Deadly Reentry. There's also the G-forces, and it doesn't have to just be on reentry. If I subject Kerbals to too many Gs on liftoff, or at any other time at all, it can kill them, and parts can be destroyed and all sorts of things. We've seen this in previous episodes where things have exploded due to excessive G-forces. Most dramatically, when I was sending the Alice probe to the moon. Whoa, and I don't remember quite what happened there. I think it was probably one of those little sort of physics time glitches where it sort of hung up for 1 or 2 frames too many, and I almost lost control of the rocket. But anyway, the Alice Mark I probe, when it detached from it had that balloon tank that just basically didn't want to stay attached to anything, and as soon as it decoupled from the upper stage, it just started spinning around, and we heard the G-force creaking noises, and then everything blew up, and it drastically shortened our flight. And there's that engine throttling down automatically as we get low on fuel, and the G-forces it's capable of are now passing, I think we're passing 5, but we're trying to keep it at 4 for as long as we can, just to make the ride more comfy. And right there, we basically burn out the stage at that point. Well, actually, no, there's still quite a bit of fuel left. We shut it down because it got to a point where it couldn't throttle down anymore, and it just started doing a very unrealistic-looking kind of jittering with the rocket being on and off. So now we separated from that tank, and we'll let it fall down. We don't need the rest of that fuel anyway. We are definitely going to get suborbital, and that's all this mission was designed to do, is just put Jebediah up into space for a little while and see what color he was when he came back. Mind you, he's already green, so I guess we have to make sure he doesn't turn purple or something. Which is another thing that's important. We're testing the life support integrity of the brand new Venture capsule. We're going to start off, of course, making sure that it has enough air and food and water for, half an hour. And if it's got that, then we'll go into orbit and see if it's got enough for, a few hours or a day. Baby steps. Because after all, we don't do unmanned tests. Now we're up into space, and the science isn't going to be huge, and I wasn't expecting to get a whole lot of science doing this early Kerbal rating testing for stuff and just putting some dudes into space and that kind of thing. I mean, we're going to get some, but it's sort of your usual values that we're all familiar with for, low Kerbin orbit from the stock game and any of that kind of thing. It's, you do a crew report and you get 8 science, and you do an EVA report and you get 8 science, and that's all fine. I've said many times before, any science is good science. I'm not really relying on stuff like manned orbital flights to really get us a whole lot of science. The purpose of this is a lot more just to make sure we can do it. There's actual knowledge being gained here rather than sort of in-game currency science points. We're making sure that the launch vehicles that I've built are going to put Kerbals into orbit, and they're going to do it safely, and they're not going to expose them to excessive G-forces, and then we make sure that we can deorbit properly, and we're just doing all of those things. Because one day, we are going to start getting all sorts of massive heaps of science from Kerbals going far and away into space and taking readings and that kind of good stuff. And at the end of all that trouble we go to do all of that, we do need to make sure of one thing at all times, and that's that we can bring them home. And that's what the early stages of our space program are going to do. while we're busy throwing probes at other heavenly bodies, we can have our first Kerbals messing around closer to home, making sure that they can handle space. And now, even though we don't really need it, because we never got into orbit in the first place, we fired up the retro rocket booster for the capsule, just to make sure it works. Again, it's a staging test, it's a performance test, kind of see what it's capable of. And it's just a solid rocket motor, basically, that burns through a bit of a strange thrust profile. That you hear it, the thrust is climbing up again now, and it was low at the start, and it'll drop off again before peaking up a little bit more right as it shuts off, which is, I guess it's a bit unusual in the KSP world, but hey, whatever. I wanted to see how it worked before having to depend on it to actually get back to Earth. I wanted to fire it up when I knew I was going to be coming back to Earth anyway. It does burn for quite a while, and it applies a fair amount. It applies a fair amount of acceleration over time. It applies delta V, I should say. The acceleration is never particularly high. It burns for a while. So I know for damn sure it's going to be able to get me out of orbit as long as I'm not in some kind of ridiculous orbit. And so we let that burn out because we can't shut it off, so we can't decouple it till it burns out. Then we decouple it and it goes nowhere. Not a big surprise, we're already only 50 kilometers up. There's lots and lots of air pushing on that engine at this time, so we'll lose it a little bit later. I'm not too worried about it being there at this point because we're not entering with all that much speed. I mean, we're coming down pretty steep, so the G-forces, as you see, they are pretty high. We do get up to about 10 there for a few seconds, which is pushing it. We don't want to see that kind of G-forces for extended periods of time on a real re-entry, but for a couple of seconds on a steep suborbital trajectory, we'll live with it. And so will Jeb. He doesn't care. Look at the fun he's having. Look at that big grin on his face down there in the bottom right of the screen. He loves it. And there was never a whole lot of danger anyway. There was never going to be a lot of re-entry effects because we weren't really going all that fast. But the worst, such as it was, is now over, and we're gently plummeting with our drogue chute deployed and RCS still firing because I forgot to turn it off. It's really not accomplishing much at this point. But then we skip through because that final parachute, as you can see, is very effective. We're falling at under 3 meters per second, and that would have been about 5 or 6 minutes worth of slowly falling, and not a whole lot was going on. I suppose I maybe could have had Jebediah get out and try to do a EVA report while hanging for dear life onto his capsule, but I didn't think to. And we splash down gently into the ocean, and we fall over gently into the ocean. And then we recover the capsule with Jebediah in it for a small slice of science and the reassurance that we can do this. So, now it's time for the real thing. This is the real venture. Maybe Venture 1, I guess. Or maybe we'll call it Venture 2. Would the suborbital one have been Venture 1? I guess I do get to decide. Maybe we'll call this one Venture 2, because the first one, it was a space flight, even if it wasn't in orbit. In any case, we'll give Jeb a rest there after his little 10G ride, and got our capsule stuck onto the top of a perfectly good Scimitar 1 launcher that I had just waiting in the sub-assembly section. I didn't even have to spend 2 hours building the thing. This time it was ready to go, and we are testing it with very few modifications to see how it's going to work as an orbital vehicle, or an orbital launch vehicle. On paper, it looks good. I mean, it looks like it's got Delta V to spare, even carrying a heavier command pod as opposed to the lighter satellite probes we've had it carrying. But I mean, this was the vehicle that launched Alice Mark II into a lunar flyby. So if it can get, you know, a little satellite like that all the way to the moon, I was pretty confident it would be able to handle the duties of sending a single Kerbal and his black-painted command capsule up into orbit, low orbit. And I guess in a few minutes, we'll see if it can. But again, the only reason it wouldn't be able to at this point is if I screw it up in flight somehow. Pilot error is about the only thing that's going to cause this to fail at this point, because the Delta V stats said it could do it. And I checked I didn't really check deeply into the thrust-to-weight ratio curves, but I had a look at what the maximums were going to be. And I've still got that setting turned on in utilities that's going to limit max acceleration to 4 Gs anyway. So I'm feeling pretty good about it at this point. I was pleasantly surprised to see that this launcher was pretty much able to do it with almost no modification. I might have even shortened the upper stage a little bit, but it's basically, I didn't have to start from scratch, which is the main thing, and that was a pleasant surprise. Because as I've said in previous episodes, when I have to build a design from scratch, it's probably going to take me 2 to 3 hours to do it. This I had done in, 5 minutes. It was great. My quickest build ever. It kind of helps when you've already done the build. Builds are fast when they're already complete. And here go the solid boosters. We're already well on our way. Of course, at this point, if something did go wrong, it wouldn't really be that big of a deal to get Bill back to Earth here, as we saw from our little suborbital flight not too long ago. He may be up high, and he may be going to get up pretty high, but he's not ever going to be going really fast. It's the speed that makes re-entry kind of scary. And actually, possibly a little bit counterintuitively, the closer you get to making orbit without making orbit, the hairier it can get when you come back down. Because if you're almost in orbit, you're probably at a velocity of around 6,000 meters per second, an orbital velocity. And if you don't make it into orbit, and you have an uncontrolled descent at 6 kilometers per second, you're going to have issues. And as at this point I realized that my clever, cunning plan to limit the acceleration to 4G doesn't work on this launcher, because that first stage motor does not throttle. And so we had that, as I mentioned, very unprofessional looking throttle jitter where the mech was basically fighting with the engine itself, telling it to throttle down, and the engine was saying, no, I don't do that. But in the end, we only peaked, I think, right around 6G, which is still not bad. I mean, anybody that's going into space is... Anybody who's going to have the courage to do something like having a rocket throw them into space is probably going to be okay if they have to endure 6Gs for a couple of seconds. And Bill's fine. He's sitting in there. He's not crazy happy like Jeb usually is, but, whatever. He's putting up with it. He's there for the ride. It's all going well. Now we're circularizing, which does take a little bit of a long time. The thrust isn't super huge on this upper stage, but it is a very, very efficient engine. So we start the burn early because we'll need to burn through apoapsis and we'll start falling again. As you see here, we are technically falling, but we're close enough now that we know we're going to make it. Nobody's worried. I'm not worried. Bill's not worried. Mission control back on the ground isn't worried. We've pretty much got it done at this point. With a little bit of final trimming. That's it. Congratulations to Bill Kerbin for being the first Kerman to orbit the Earth. You might be thinking, well, he hasn't done that yet. He just got there. Well, okay, yes. But because he's there, as long as we don't do anything else, he is going to orbit the Earth. So that's how I know. Has nothing to do with the fact that I've already done this and am doing post-commentary after the fact. That's... no, not at all. And, you know, unfortunately, we do have to leave some garbage in orbit this time, but sometimes you gotta. Besides, it's the 60s. We don't care about that yet. So we line ourselves up to fly facing retrograde, and Bill decides he's going to get out and go for a walk. Because, hey, why not? He's up there. What else is he going to do? He already had a snack, and he might be a Kerbal, but he doesn't like to do nothing but eat snacks. So he's going to burn off some of that energy from eating his snacks, and he's going to go for a little float around the capsule and inspect it for any unforeseen stresses or damage from the ascent, and he's loving it. Now he's all sorts of excited. And you know what? I think I would be too if I were there. That would be, we've all seen pictures of what it looks like to take, you know, to look at the Earth from the space station or whatever the case may be. And it looks pretty awesome, and it would be pretty awesome to be there. Of course I think so, and probably anybody who's watching this would think so. Why wouldn't you think that if you're interested in something like this? I think we all know how great it would be to be up there ourselves. And everything's looking good. The straps are still securely holding our re-entry rocket onto our capsule. So Bill decides everything's in good order and floats back gently over to the capsule and gets in. And then we float around for a while and we look out the window occasionally at the wonder of the planet below. But now it's time to eventually get ourselves home. So I fire up the solid rocket retro booster, which, as I said, you know, it just does its thing. It has its kind of thrust pattern where it gets low and comes up and gets low again. And I'm looking at the orbit shape and I'm thinking, wow, this rocket is going to burn for a long time, and my periapsis is already under the surface, and I don't need to do this anymore, and I wish I could shut this off, and I can't shut it off. So I decide it's time for some intentional steering loss. And then I'm realizing, okay, well, burning directly upward isn't really quite cutting it. So after a little bit of that, I decide, okay, we'll just finish this off by burning prograde. We'll burn our retro boosters prograde. Because I just didn't like the idea of descending that steeply. I mean, the capsule handled it like a champ on the suborbital flight, but I just didn't want to take the risk. So now, finally, thank God, we're out of fuel in that solid booster. And, you know, the periapsis isn't a couple of 1,000 kilometers underneath the surface. We don't have a suicidally steep descent angle. It is beneath the surface, but then, you know, that's fine. We'll come in over the Atlantic Ocean, and after we sail gracefully over North America at many, many, many miles per hour, I don't know how many, it's 8 kilometers a second, that's I'm sure that's got to be 25,000 miles per hour. I'm not a miles per hour person. I'm Canadian. Leave me alone. And now the crucial stage begins where things start getting warm and bright and glowy and surrounded by plasma. And this is the point where we find out whether or not that slightly steeper than normal, but thankfully not terribly steeper than normal, descent profile causes any trouble. 4 Gs of deceleration there, coming up on 5. Nice healthy orange glow from the bottom of the capsule. Getting up to 6G. Temperature looks okay. The actual temperature looks fine. 7G almost. I was actually expecting it to get a lot hotter, but I think it's okay. It's going to get a little hotter yet as we approach, 8G. The deceleration is still intensifying. The pressure on the capsule is, still good and high, even at this kind of altitude. Temperature's still good, though. Actually, it's positively cool on the front end of that capsule, and now we've passed the peak deceleration and we're coming back down through 8G. It was just short of 9 that we peaked that time, which is a bit better. We don't want to be peaking at 10 or 11 if we can avoid it, so that was actually pretty good. Now we're down to 6. I mean, you'd still be... Bill's still feeling it up in his capsule there for sure, down around 5. Still some pretty impressive force on him in that capsule, but nothing that's going to kill him, and that's the important part. Now down to, down through 4G, approaching 3G, already coming down closer to 2G of deceleration, and that's almost every day levels of deceleration that we're feeling at this point. Speed is good and low now. Altitude is good and low. We're almost back home, and we're through the worst of it. The only thing stopping us now is going to be a parachute malfunction. But I checked many times for parachute programming on the way down in footage that I skipped, because as we've seen before, it does take quite a long time to actually see anything worth seeing when we're re-entering the atmosphere. Now we're plummeting gently. However that works. I don't usually associate the words plummet and gentle together, but we are plummeting gently, and now the first parachute pre-deploys to kind of start slowing us down a little bit more. And our velocity is already good and low. I mean, as high as we are and as slow as we're going, it's going to take a while to finish falling all the way to the surface. In fact, I think I'm about to spare some of that time as that first drogue chute cuts away, and now the main chute is out, pre-deployed for just awaiting its pre-programmed altitude of, I think, about 700 meters, when the strings on that'll slacken and we'll actually get the whole parachute will come out and arrest our descent, just like that. And there we go, we splash down gently, and we bounce gently, and again and again. And there we go. Now we're just about done bouncing. Now the recovery team can sail halfway across the Atlantic and come find Bill, because he's got a day or so of food in there, and we're good to go. So again, not a hell of a lot of science. It's not that much different from the stock game in that respect, where you're not meant to get a heap of science just for having put something into orbit and brought it back. Most of the science is from those custom experiments I've been doing. And then we'll get a little more for doing usual stuff much farther away than we just got. But that will have to wait for future episodes. And until then, I've been Cerberus, and we'll see you next time. Today's episode of Space's Hard Vacuum has been brought to you by the number 2. And the word of the day is Kerbal rated. Happy Kerbling!